Well, I'd like to extend my welcome to everyone this afternoon to the first of our spring 2016 risk regulation seminars. I'm Kerry Colanisi, and I direct the Penn program on regulation, a university-wide program dedicated to, of all things, regulation, with a title like that. And we're very pleased to work together with the Wharton Risk Center. Very grateful that you host us here for these seminars. I wanted, before I turn things over to Howard Kunruth, who's the director of the Wharton Risk Center, wanted to alert everyone to the next two seminars that will be scheduled for this spring. On March 1st, Maureen Cropper at the University of Maryland, Distinguished University Professor of Economics, will be speaking on another environmental regulatory issue, the net benefits of the acid rain program. So if you're interested in finding out how well emissions trading at a national level actually turns out, that will be one not to miss. And then in April 5th, we will have Detmoff von Winterfeld from University of Southern California here to talk about some of the latest research on risk analysis being done with respect to homeland security and terrorism risks. So we have quite a lineup still to come, but you're all here for an exciting talk and discussion of the Paris Agreement. So with that, I will turn things over to Howard Kunruth. Well, thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Kerry, and let me welcome all of you, and I think you are in for a really exciting afternoon. It's a joint presentation with Jacquet and Dale Jamieson. Let me say a brief word about them. Jacquet is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at NYU, a social scientist who's interested in large-scale transboundary cooperation dilemmas, especially overfishing, which I know you've done some fair amount of work on, as well as climate change, which we'll be hearing about today, and the internet. She's author of Is Shame Necessary?, which may have something to do with some of the remarks that you'll be hearing. Are we going to shame people into doing the right thing? And the evolution, function, and future of the use of social discipline. Dale Jamieson, who I've known for a number of years now, is a professor of environmental studies and philosophy and chair of the Environmental Studies Department at NYU. He's the author of, and listen to this title, it's an important one, Reason in a Dark Time, Why the Struggle to Stop Climate Change Failed and What It Means for Our Future, which you'll hear a bit more about today, and several other books. He's also edited books, one of them being Reflecting on Nature, Readings in Environmental Philosophy. Now let me just say a few words about on a personal note, because Dale and I were together when I was on sabbatical at the University of Colorado and had an opportunity to have a number of dialogues on issues of social importance. And I always felt, coming out of that there was a new way of thinking about problems that I would not have had I not interacted with Dale. And so it's really my pleasure to introduce both Dale and Jennifer today. Now, what we're going to be hearing about is living with climate change, will Paris make a difference? And I think what I know we're all aware of is there have been many different views of what came out of Paris. There are some who say, you know, we didn't have any binding agreements, it's a failure. There are others who said, look at all the countries having come together and signed an agreement here, and there are opportunities. And I think what I'm looking forward to is getting both Jennifer and Dale's view on what it means to make the climate change conference, the COP21, a success, so that we can all say we're really taking the right steps. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
So we have a lot of slides, but we will try not to monopolize your attention for too long so that we have time for discussion. This is basically the outline of the talk. I'll begin with this slightly ironic digression that I can't resist. Then we'll talk about the Paris Agreement and its relation to the FCCC. Then Jennifer will talk about the strategies that may actually make it a success. I'll come back to identify some vulnerabilities and to conclude with some soaring rhetoric.
Yeah, I'll just say what FCCC is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Knows.
Yes, sorry. FCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And you will not only hear a lot more about that later in the talk, but you will see some mind-numbingly boring prose that is directly lifted out of the convention. So if there's one thing you will learn by the end of this, okay. Right. Okay. So, so Howard is right that there are sort of kind of mixed views about what we're going to get out of Paris, but really sort of the first impulse, the first wave of publicity was about the enormous success that Paris was. Paris Climate Change Agreement, the world's greatest diplomatic success, according to The Guardian. You know, you see these really interesting people who I'm going to talk about all holding their hands like they've just won the World Welterweight Championship or something along those lines. You know, Tom Friedman says the Paris Climate Accord is a big, big deal. And nothing we say is really going to be in disagreement with this. And of course, you know, the world was especially, I think, happy to have a climate success after the debacle of Copenhagen. And I always love this picture because it's a real, oh my God moment for the kind of leadership of the world. Everything has sort of fallen apart. The so-called Danish text, you know, has been leaked and everyone is freaking out because they haven't shared it with the developing countries. Everything is falling apart. And then you have about 6 or 7 of the most powerful people in the world sitting around a room saying, how do you spell ratification? You know, and they're all like trying to scrawl something out to create the Copenhagen Accord so that the whole thing doesn't just crash and burn. But of course, from the point of view of much of the world, Copenhagen did crash and burn. So everyone was ready for a success in Paris. You know, I mean, people often say the UN is too big to fail, and in a way the Paris Climate Conference was an example of this. Now, Surya Sethi, who is actually a former Indian diplomat, who actually is quite critical of the agreement. He really dislikes the agreement. He thinks it's going to fail. He thinks it's bad for India. And even Surya Sethi says, the French...
Vive la France.
Okay. Anyway, Surya Sethi is essentially incredibly fulsome in his praise, particularly for the French. The French, especially Francois Hollande and Laurent Fabius, deserve the appreciation of the entire world for avoiding the Copenhagen-like type embarrassment. Gracious, enlightened hosts, every tool of statesmanship and diplomacy. This is a first for climate. Vive la France. Okay. Now, I'm not wanting to take anything away from this, but where was I? Oh, yes, Vive la France. Now again, I mean, I love France. It was a big success in many ways. It's all a complicated issue. But when I see these guys on the stage and all this going on, I mean, I think it kind of helps to remember something. This is the Rainbow Warrior, which was a ship that was bombed by the French Secret Service in Auckland Harbor in 1985. This is the Spanish photographer who was killed in this act of state-sponsored terrorism against an environmental organization. This is his daughter holding a picture of her and her father before he died. Laurent Fabius was the prime minister of France at that time, the youngest prime minister in French history. And after a period of a couple of months of denial, the French government appointed an investigator and still denied. And finally, in September, basically the French conceded that its agents had bombed the Rainbow Warrior. Fabius claimed, and probably rightly, that he had no prior knowledge of this, though he says, well, the truth in this affair is cruel. He refused to name the agents who carried out the attack. It would be unacceptable to expose military personnel who were obeying orders, right, to this kind of danger. You know, this is an act of state-sponsored terrorism. Now, subsequently, we have come to know that one of the people who carried out this attack was Gerard Royal. It's not clear whether he was actually there putting the bomb on the boat or whether he was on the Zodiac that brought the bomber to the Rainbow Warrior. but there's no question that he was one of the secret agents who was involved in this mission. All right, who's Gerard Royal? The brother of Ségolène Royal, former candidate for the presidency of France, and the Minister of Climate Change and Ecology during the Paris COP, and also partner of nearly 30 years of President François Hollande. Former partner for nearly 30 years. Well, partner for nearly 30 years, no longer partner. Twice removed, I think, President François Hollande. So when we go back and we look at these figures on the stage and we think, Vive la France, yes, but let's remember Prime Minister during the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, Royal, who's not on the stage, brother of one of the agents who carried it out, and of course this was his common-law brother-in-law. It just, again, takes nothing, it's a digression, takes nothing away from the events of the moment, but it might at least prime us for a bit of sobriety in evaluating what went on in Paris in December. Okay, the problem that we face essentially with climate change is that climate change is a collective action problem, the world's largest collective action problem, and the task is to motivate climate change actors to do more than they would do on a business as usual scenario. That's essentially the structure of the problem. And there are two basic ways of trying to do this. One way is bottom up, where it's a matter of self-imposed voluntary commitments with transparency and regular review. This is the approach that's characteristic of trade agreements, or what's called top-down, to align individual interests with collective interests by solving assurance problems through legally binding obligations, for example, in the CITES Treaty. Now, there's a lot in the literature that sort of pulls these two apart as being extremely different approaches. It should be remembered that in a world of sovereign states, action is always to a great extent going to be bottom up, and so we shouldn't really exaggerate this difference. But again, a lot has been made of this. So for example, Dan Esty writes, the new agreement represents a breakthrough in a number of important respects. It shifts from a top-down strategy that relied upon national governments to mandate emissions reductions to more of a bottom-up approach. Now, actually, I think that's not quite right, that there really is a third approach we might think of as a hybrid approach, and the climate regime is an example of that, but the really successful precursor was the ozone regime. And it essentially involves the agreement to a framework convention and then the further establishment of protocols, binding protocols, that are within the structure of the framework convention. So when it comes to the case of climate, we had the framework convention, which was agreed to in Rio in 1992. There were all sorts of voluntary commitments written into the framework convention that I'll talk about in a minute. It was clear that they were not going to be kept, particularly by the United States. So in 1995 in Berlin, the countries, the members of the COP basically said, we're going to agree to a protocol with binding emissions reductions, which they did in Kyoto in 1997. And although there's more to be said, I think, on behalf of Kyoto than typically gets said, the fact is it was radically insufficient for addressing the problem. And so now we get to Paris in 2015, and to a great extent, this is a return to the bottom-up approach that is in the Framework Convention in the first place. And now, what is essential? What are the key points of the Paris Agreement? Well, one is to hold the goal of global temperature to below 2 degrees centigrade. It involves voluntary pledges from all parties to curb emissions. One thing that's interesting is the long-term global goal is net zero emissions, and this is not a global goal. This is a goal for each individual country. There'll be a stock-taking meeting every 5 years. There'll be money for adaptation. and there's also some language about loss and damage. Loss and damage is the kind of euphemism term that's used in the climate regime to talk about the losses and damages that some very poor countries, low-lying states, for example, have suffered, will suffer as a result, essentially, of other people's emissions. Now, it's reasonable, I think, to ask what the Paris Agreement actually adds to the Framework Convention, since, in effect, what's happened is we had a Framework Convention, we had a protocol, we decided that didn't work very well, it was insufficient, and now we've essentially gone back to a more bottom-up approach. What does it really add? Well, I want to suggest that it actually adds less than you might think in terms of the legal architecture. It makes some things more specific, so the objective of the Framework Convention is stabilization at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Essentially, through the years, we've decided that that's notionally 2 degrees centigrade, and that's written now into the Paris Agreement. There are principles in the Framework Convention that the parties should be guided by. They should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. Accordingly, developed country parties should take the lead. Okay? And as we'll see, those principles are in Paris as well. There are specific commitments that all countries have, not just developed countries. One of the things that's often said is that developing countries had no obligations in the climate regime prior to Paris. This is not true. Developing countries had a whole list of obligations. Now, you might not think they were particularly onerous. They actually were onerous in some respects for some countries, but that's another question. But again, they have to do with making national action plans to mitigate climate change, for cooperation, to promote sustainable development, to cooperate in preparing for adaptation, to take climate change considerations into account when it comes to planning. So there's a whole list of commitments that all countries had. And the developed countries in particular had some further commitments under the Framework Convention. And B is, of course, what's most important here, that in order to promote progress, each of these parties shall communicate within 6 months of the entry into force of the convention, and periodically thereafter, detailed information on its policies and measures with the aim of returning to their 1990 levels these anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Now, you might think that the only real problem with the Framework Convention is that the developed countries didn't live up to their obligations. So what does Paris add to this? There's also language in the Framework Convention on new and additional financial resources, also to aid in adaptation, technology transfer, and so on. Well, essentially, Paris is Copenhagen. This is according to Dan Badansky. It essentially has, rather than using the language of the developing countries, the so-called Annex I, non-Annex I countries, it essentially asks for pledges from all countries. It's a durable agreement in the sense that there's no expiration date for the Paris Agreement. It will go on forever. And it provides a rule-based structure for how to go forward in the future. Now, where does this leave us? Well, on sort of business as usual scenarios, we were looking at about a 4.5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature. By the way, I want to say at the outset, when you see charts like this, generally don't believe them. Because the truth is, nobody really knows much that's very determinate about climate sensitivity. Climate sensitivity could be much greater than we think, it could be less than we think. These are sort of best guesses about climate sensitivity and how different levels of greenhouse gases actually map onto this very abstract number, which is mean surface temperature. So this is very, very rough estimates. People tend to treat them like, these are real sort of facts in the world, but they're just rough estimates. So business as usual, you get about 4.5 degrees centigrade. If you follow current policies that are in place, you get about 3.6 degrees centigrade. If you look at the Paris pledges, you get 2.7 degrees centigrade, right? So even though Paris says we're going to hold below 2, we really want 1.5, actually in the basis of the pledges we have, it's 2.7. So there's going to have to be, for Paris to really work in its own terms, there's going to have to be both a ratcheting up of ambition and a keeping of the commitments that are made, even to the higher levels of ambition. And as you can see from this chart, well, a lot of work remains to be done by the EU and certainly by the United States. A lot of work is going to have to be done by China, by India, and by other developing countries. And when you think about how hard it is in our domestic political system and all of our problems and so on to actually get on this pathway for the United States, this gives you some idea of how difficult it's going to be for countries like India that still have about 300 million people who have no access to electricity. So this chart just simply summarizes the kinds of improvements, the kinds of changes that are going to have to be made by countries in various categories. But I think I'm going to just skip over that very quickly, and my colleague Jennifer Jacquet is going to explain to you how this will be done, if it is to be done.
That it could be done, yes. Let me turn on my microphone. Testing, testing. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. So one of the ways that it could be done, I think, with this bottom-up approach, so in the top-down approach, we have the sanctions, right? Sometimes financial, sometimes trade. And in the bottom-up approach, the argument is, what do we have to hold people to their commitments? And this is why a lot of people actually expressed disappointment with Paris, that it wasn't legally binding with sanctions. And then the US delegation kept doing their PR to try to convince people it was legally binding. But the sanctions indeed were off the table. And Thomas Schelling has this nice line that a potent means of commitment, and sometimes the only means, is the pledge of one's reputation. And I want to argue that reputation is a really important element of cooperation, that it works at scale, and that it's particularly valuable in cooperation dilemmas, rather than in certain other types of dilemmas that we might get to discuss. And so instead of calling it pledge and review, which is essentially the approach of the Paris Agreement, some even called the Paris Agreement a name and shame approach, that this was going to mean that people who did not live up to their commitments would be shamed in the future. Now, what do I mean by shame? Is the US really going to feel shame if it doesn't meet its 5-year target? I'm talking about shame as a tool, as a way of stigmatizing or singling out a transgressor to public opinion. And what's interesting about the Paris Agreement, having 196 parties on board, is that does change what is normal with regards to climate action. And we know that stigma is maximized at very high or very low participation rates, depending on the problem. So, like I said, I am interested in shame as a tool, less so as an emotional response, as a psychological response, and as a way of changing behavior, even at scale. But the way that we study cooperation and some of these tools is often in the lab with individuals. So I just wanted to start with an experiment my colleagues and I did using reputation to see if the threat of shame or the promise of honor would enhance cooperation in a real-world dilemma. So you can decide how real-world this is. These are undergraduates who come into the lab. We divide them so that they can't see one another, and we give them a fake name, and they can see their decisions along with the decisions of the other players in the room on a screen. They're also given money to start the game with. This is just a typical public goods experiment that is designed to capture a cooperation dilemma. In this case, they started the game with $12 because they were playing for 12 rounds, and they had the choice to give $1 or not at each round of the game. Now, these are really common experiments, again, designed to look at cooperation. There's often punishment built into these games where you can pay a certain amount of your endowment to extract an even larger amount from a player who's not cooperating. But this has been the way that punishment has been conceived of in these economic experiments. So very much like the top-down sanctioning approach. I was curious about this kind of bottom-up reputational effect. So these were the first experiments where we said punishment will not be monetary at all. It will be reputation-based. So just to finish explaining the experiment, what they do is they can give them $1 or not at each round to a public pool, and then this money is doubled and redistributed evenly among all players regardless of whether or not they cooperate. So this works very well with undergraduates because we say, think about a group project where you'll all get the same grade no matter how much each of you contributes, right? But if you all don't contribute, you'll all fail the project. But the temptation, of course, is to free ride off the hard work of other people in your group and still manage to get an A. So in a scenario in which everyone gives $1 in the first round, everyone gets an additional $1 back. We double and redistribute the money, and so every player at the end of that first round actually walks away with $13 instead of $12. This is real money. They're playing for keeps. Doesn't seem like a lot in a business school, I know, but they really play like it matters. And then there's a scenario where everyone defects, and this is exactly how we explain it to them, and everyone just keeps the money at their desk. They all get the $12. Now, here's where we get the tension, where 3 players give, 3 players don't. We double that $3 to 6. Everyone gets then $1 back, and now we start to see this asymmetry emerge where some players are better off than others. So again, the sort of individual self-interest is maximized if you do not donate, but all the 5 other players in your group do donate. But if everyone thinks this way, cooperation devolves. So in our experiments, at the end of round 10, we told students that we would ask the 2 least generous players in the group to come forward and write their name on the board under a sign that said, I donated the least. And then they would sit back down and play 2 additional rounds. So this was to test the threat of shame just to cooperation in general. Yes, we had ethics approval, and yes, all the students in the room knew the rules of the game when it started. They could opt out if they wanted. They could also avoid the shame if they wanted. And then we had a treatment in which we allowed honor, where we said the exact same rules of the game. We would call the 2 most cooperative players up to the front of the room, and the other 4 players in both treatments would remain completely anonymous. Now, this is just to get at some of these theoretical underpinnings about the way reputation works. And this is some real data from a game in which 2 players who donated the least, you can see their contributions out of 10 rounds were 0. This person gave $0 out of 10, perhaps the United States of the group. And this player only gave 4. Now they maximized their overall earnings from the public pool, but they were also called forward to write their name on the board. So I gave them blushes to simulate the shame. I didn't actually see anyone blush, interestingly. And then we had honor. This is some real data where students gave, again, a kind of spread of money to the game, but these 2 players gave distinctly the most. We opened up envelopes where the pseudonym was attached to their real name. Those 2 players came forward. They sat back down. Again, there are no financial benefits to this reward and punishment. It is purely a reputational effect. They have the financial benefits only from the game. So we also asked, what was your strategy when you played? Because we were trying to get a sense of how people responded to this tool, whether or not it affected their decision making. Incidentally, we also had a control in which everyone remained anonymous for the entire game. So this player says, I had no strategy, I gave more to earn more. We had some evidence that players did want to receive the honor. Eventually, I wanted to be known as the top contributor. But we had a lot more evidence that players were trying to avoid the stigma of shame. They did not want their name exposed. I did not want to be the least 2 contributors. I didn't want my name on the board. Then we had some, perhaps, business school students. I didn't give at all because humans are selfish to begin with. I disagree with working toward the common goal. Hence, my theory was right. The more self-centered you are, the more money you get. Even though in almost every game, players walked away with less than $24. So they could have had more money if they had cooperated. Also, perhaps living near us now on Wall Street, make sounds with coins and envelopes before handing in, but contribute nothing. So we were playing with the Canadian loonies. These are the people in Vegas right now. They contribute randomly. If it was heads, they donated. If it was tails, they wouldn't. They gave in even numbers plus the lucky number 7. Of course, this drives economists crazy for the kind of decision making. I contributed at the 4th round because 4 is my lucky number. You're just like, I'd rather not know your strategy. And here was our smartest student, I thought. I gave it first, and I stopped giving because other people are stupid, selfish, and don't know how to do math. So kind of sums up. That is probably the business school. These were actually all math majors as well, so. So here are the results from our work that shame and honor both enhanced cooperation about 50%, which was significant, especially because there was just that binary choice between giving or not in each round relative to the anonymous control. So this was just trying to lay some foundational literature to show that reputation can enhance cooperation even without an additional financial incentive. And what we know, basically, anecdotally, it's much harder to study groups in the lab, but that reputation does scale then to the group level, that businesses, countries are making some decisions based on the threat of stigma or reputation. It may have been at work in this campaign, which highlighted, it was called the map of shame. It was Amnesty International and a bunch of other human rights organizations highlighting the countries around the world in 2004 who were still executing juvenile offenders. It may have tipped the scales in some states, maybe even played a role in the Supreme Court's decision to outlaw that behavior in 2005. And we see shaming at work regularly in civil society broadly. So here's a campaign to shame the financing of mountaintop coal removal in Appalachia. This was for JP Morgan Chase. And this one was a campaign really targeted on Barclays. And this campaign had been going on for at least 8 years. And just last year, Barclays announced they would end the financing of mountaintop coal removal from their portfolios. And shame works obviously best, as I mentioned, with those high or low participation rates, but also when there's a really clear norm around what behavior is expected. So an interesting case I'll just tell you about is voting. So in the US, we have less than half of people voting in non-presidential elections, right? So we actually have pretty low participation rates, but the feeling that people ought to vote is very widespread. Like 87% of Americans believe that you ought to vote even though we're not voting. So this element of expectation also changes the shame and honor game, because you can have low rates of participation but high expectations, and this can catalyze the tool. And this arguably happened in advance of Paris. So some of you probably saw The Guardian's massive campaign. It covered their web platform and their print paper with this oil slick. We know about the enormous efforts by all sorts of actors within society, NGOs, religion, the business sector, executive power, and leaders more generally religious and otherwise. And even at COP21, which I managed to attend for a few days, where I was looking for stigma and honor at work, some of you may know about the Fossil of the Day Award, where they present the biggest defector in the negotiations that day. So it's at 6 p.m. every day. You can go and watch this announcement about the Fossil of the Day, the worst country, and they explain all the reasons why they're highlighted as the worst that day. It's a very well-attended event at COP21. People are very interested in this information. And some side events were going on as well. This one was a mock trial, although the organizer said, "We assure you this will not be mock forever," of a trial of the People versus ExxonMobil for their role in climate denial and beyond. But in the lead up to Paris, I think we have kind of a good indication of how reputation may be catalyzed post-Paris, because there was an effort, again, this expectation that countries would submit their INDCs in advance of the COP. So their national determined contributions, what is it? It's individually, well, whatever. I'm always forgetting what that term means, but what they plan to pledge. And so Cristiano Figueres was really active on Twitter always, like really promoting who had submitted and giving a lot of honor to these countries. And then even in advance of Paris, let me go back. Oh, they posted the INDCs then on the FCCC website. And then civil society groups took that information and would make infographics of who had committed what. Like Dale pointed out, kind of what these commitments meant to the overall different goals, but also just kind of binary who was actively participating in advance of the conference. So 184 parties did submit, and only 196 were involved overall. So that was kind of a major effort where there was no top-down sanctions involved with having to submit. It was purely kind of peer pressure in the international community. And then after those were all submitted, we had civil society groups tracking how well those commitments lived up to certain kinds of expectations. So here it was about the 2 °C limit, and they ranked countries inadequate to role model, although no one achieved that level. And then sometimes the US, this was in Nature Climate Change, would get additional scrutiny because emissions are asymmetric, and some countries, I think, wind up getting more scrutiny than others. And then some groups said, well, we're more interested in whether or not groups are committing their fair share. Maybe the 2-degree target wasn't their biggest priority, and they also reviewed countries and highlighted the worst in terms of fair share, as well as the best. But they were singling out countries who are not living up to either their commitments or what these people thought they should have committed to. And of course, I think the exciting thing post-COP is also the various ways that we're conceiving of responsibility and using stigmatization beyond just the nation state. So we have now also the idea that individuals or NGOs, and especially NGOs are probably more important in terms of using the spotlight than being the target, but various levels of involvement. So rather than the nation state as being kind of, I think, the traditional way of seeing emissions, we could conceive of it as individual emissions, which has been done, showing that 1 billion high emitters are really responsible for the vast majority of climate change. We could single out, as researchers have done in the last few years, the investor-owned corporations that are most responsible for climate change. The Guardian did a nice visualization of the top 90 producers broken down into nation-state, state-owned, and investor-owned corporations. If you target in on that investor-owned, then you can see the breakdown even further. This is the kind of I would argue, shaming that is going on in sort of the 2015 landscape. And Dale has made the point in the paper, which I think is really important, that one thing that's fundamentally different between 92 and now is 30 years of experience that gets us thinking really about who is really responsible and how will we get them to change their behavior. This is another campaign I'm looking at closely and really like. It's a group called Bank Track. They single out, rather than the investor-owned corporations, the banks that are financing them, and especially in this case, they're highlighting the top 20 coal banks of 2005 to April 2014. AP Morgan Chase is really the worst on the list. And then the way individuals now are kind of being asked to be engaged is not through just their individual emissions or their carbon footprints, but it's through their retirement funds, shifting their investments to no carbon funds, and through their shareholder behavior and activity. So saying that you're going to be singled out as even a shareholder in the future if you don't vote for climate change mitigation. So just to finish up, there are two main points I want to make. That shame really works best in social dilemmas where the group cares about the outcome, right? So this is an app that alerts your entire social network if you push the snooze button too many times in the morning. This is a total, I think, misfire of when shame should be used and when it will work well. I don't care, right, if you've overslept for your job. Maybe if your boss is part of your social network. And then some of you will say, well, you showed us that shame and honor work equally well. Why focus on the stigmatization side? And I think what you'll find is especially in threshold public goods dilemmas or collective risk dilemmas where you really need a certain amount of participation to get the dilemma into a sort of a tipping point, like vaccinations, like climate change, you'll see that the attention tends to be toward the defectors rather than the best players. But I think both will be at work in the future and are part of the package of Pledge and Review. Yeah?
So, to wrap, I mean, one way of summarizing what we're saying is, that's the on button, is to say that if Paris succeeds, it will not be so much because of the text, but because of the context of what's going on outside the agreement itself. But the agreement is vulnerable, and the process is vulnerable in a number of ways. The Paris Agreement is actually built on the back of the US-China bilateral agreement and of 2014. And US, China, and India together are responsible for almost 50% of all emissions. If those relationships are not maintained, the whole agreement could become irrelevant. There's also a resistance to transparency, certainly third-party review transparency in both India and China that could become problematical in the future. There is also a kind of schizophrenia and opacity in American politics that can send paradoxical signals to the rest of the world. For example, the recent Supreme Court decision that essentially stayed the Clean Power Plan may not, in the long run, actually materially affect US emissions. But it sends a very confusing signal to people outside the United States about whether the United States will continue to be a cooperative partner, especially with respect to an agreement for which President Obama has taken a great deal of credit. Then finally, some people have said that one of the things that's really important about Copenhagen is that about Paris is that the stark division between developed and developing countries has now been dissolved. We've gotten past that. The language of Annex I countries and non-Annex I countries isn't in the text of the Paris Agreement, but it's still there. That language is still in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the tensions between developed and developing countries actually remain very high. And a lot is going to depend on the $100 billion adoption fund and whether the developed countries really will pony up that money, because that's really what's in the agreement for the developing countries. So, was Paris a success? Well, there's an old apocryphal story. It's actually apocryphal, but it's still a good story, that Zhou Enlai was once asked whether the French Revolution was a success, to which he is supposed to have answered, "It's too early to tell." Thank you very much.
I'm bringing you both up here, and what we'd like to do is we'd like to just get some comments and questions for Dale and Jennifer. They've obviously stimulated an interesting dialogue here, and your experiments certainly raised some very interesting questions. I'm going to start off with a question, and then we'll open it up and people should introduce themselves. I think one of the real challenges, at least in hearing what you had to say, was the fact that there is shame and there is honor, but there's also economic considerations that each of these countries are facing. And the developing countries face them, and clearly the developed countries as well. And we've heard a lot about that. I'm wondering if you could say a word about how you balance off, or how you manage to sort of bring together the concepts at the end of the day. That, we may be, shame is a part of it, but we also are going to suffer if we do a set of things. And how do we sort of balance that off? And could each or both of you?
Right. So, so the first thing to say, I think, is is not maybe very popular in a business school, but how even economic welfare is construed with respect to a problem that has a time horizons of centuries depends on normative assumptions. So, for example, whether a particular policy is in your economic self-interest depends enormously on the discount rate that you attach to future damages. And that decision about the discount rate, I would argue, is not itself an economic decision. It's essentially a value-driven decision that depends essentially on the prevailing attitudes towards the future. Now, what I think is more important than just simple economic benefits are distributional considerations. And that has a lot to do with particular governments and particular societies that have higher and lesser degrees of tolerance for distributional dislocations. And that, too, is a kind of cultural and value-driven fact.
Well, and you used to say, or you are saying, I think I have it on, but I think you should mention about the slavery issue, which maps well onto that question, too. No?
Yeah,
or is that 2014?
So I don't know if this is directly relevant, but maybe. So in another paper, I've tried to, I've looked back at this question. Where has it been the case that people have actually, a society has actually made dramatic change when it seemed, in this case, to be contrary to its economic self-interest? And the really clearest case, I think, is the British abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, which at that time was responsible for, depending on the estimate, about anywhere between 2 to 4% of British GDP. They owned the Atlantic slave trade, and yet they were the first nation to abolish it. And it's interesting to go back because at the time, they had a lot of wacky economic theories about how they actually weren't going to be hurt economically by abolishing the slave trade, which turned out actually to be wrong. But sometimes people tell themselves these false economic stories, too, to help them do the thing that they think is the morally right thing to do.
Why don't we open it up and have some questions, and also introduce yourself. You could, please.
Hi, I'm Rob Struck. I'm a second-year MBA student here. So I have two questions for you, kind of related. If it's too early to say, when do you think we'll have some leading indicators in order to determine whether we're kind of on the right course or not? And if this last COP was such a big success, what does the next one entail? Or are we done with COPs forever?
Well, COPs happen every year, just like winter and summer. There's going to be something called a facilitative dialogue that's going to be coming around in a couple of years. That will begin to give us the first hints of where things are going. And in 5 years is the first stock-taking meeting. And by then, I think we'll really have a very clear signal of what direction countries are going in.
Yeah, please. And then introduce yourself. Yeah.
So I'm a senior here in Wharton. And so you both studied this question from a more almost philosophical, social perspective. And I was wondering, do you think to be able to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, the 2 degrees Celsius goal, will we need an environmental leader among all these countries to kind of lead everybody forward, or just make sure that there's no one lagging behind, but do we also need someone forward?
Well, I think the key relationships are China, India, and the United States. And then you get accretions around, important accretions behind that. But particularly the bilateral relationship between the United States and China, I think, is key to making this whole thing work. And of course, that can fall apart in all sorts of different ways. It can also be true that each country, because of independent economic and political motivations, still may stay in the same trajectory, even if the bilateral relationship is not doing so well. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. But I think you really have to look at the big emitters.
Do you have the feeling if they cooperate and do the sets of things that they're going to say they'll do, that will be a real catalyst for, this is part of the dilemma, the Commons dilemma problem. You have few leaders that will train the others, or at least the others will honor commitments as a result of that. That's the hope, I gather.
Right, and also going back to your economic point, Howard, one thing I think people tend not to think about is, is we have this incredible economic concentration of power, traditionally in the Middle East, but in the North Sea with Norway and Britain. The fossil fuel industry has created these economic powerhouses. As the world will get off carbon at some point. The question is when, how much damage will be done, how much change will occur. And there's going to be new concentrations of economic power that's going to be around renewable energy. And I'm convinced that China wants to be the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy, and that that's part of what motivates China to partner in this agreement.
Introduce yourself, please.
Dave Cragen with Merck. And I'm interested how countries made their commitments. Just to take a specific example, the Philippines committed to a 70% reduction. But an article in the Wall Street Journal in December said by 2020 they're planning to triple their coal use, and by 2035 be the top Asian economy dependent on coal. So how does those two factors mesh?
Some of them are just plain delusional. I mean, I was in Mexico at the time that they were making their commitment, and we're talking to some people who are involved in domestic climate change policy, and they said that the way to explain Mexico's commitment was entirely that they wanted to be an early actor in alliance with the United States. That was all. So there's a lot about this which is very flimsy and very puffy.
But
So what do you think is going to happen? I mean, I think Steve's question, though, raises a point that people say they're going to do things and your feeling is they won't. Or they'll be shamed into not doing it or honored into doing a better job. I'm trying to understand essentially how that's going to play out.
yeah, so I think we have to think about this a little differently in terms of the high and low participation rates. We have to layer on top of that the asymmetry. And I think this gets to your point about leadership that gets interesting. So if we take two scenarios, one in which US, China, and India do everything, maybe we're less worried about the defection of the other 193 parties. But if we have an inverse situation where China and India or US are failing to live up to their promises and the other 193 are, then we have a different context, I think, where these, which may or may not matter ultimately, but I do think we have to think about them in sort of with the asymmetry in mind, you know, completely. Philippines may or may not wind up being a...
I mean, there are going to be, I mean, some countries are not going to live up to, I mean, it's that simple. And I think Jennifer's point is it won't matter in some cases and it does matter in others. There's also going to be economic tipping points in this whole process that are going to be very important. And I mean, God knows, I'm never mistaken for an optimist. But what looks impossible for the Philippines now might look very different if the world got on another path over the next 2 decades towards renewable energy. The economic payoff structure might actually look different then.
And there's even some evidence today that it's really competitive in certain ways with respect to coal. Please.
Charlie Howland. I've got a cold. My day job is as a lawyer for EPA. My night job is I teach a course here in regulation and energy law at Villanova Law School. I find myself feeling a little bit dubious about the merits of the experiment, but since my brother-in-law does the same kind of experiments, I should defer to him. Isn't there a much better experiment that's been run since 1986? And I'm curious if you've looked at that. And that's the role of shaming potentially in toxics release.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
So is there any news? So the toxics relief inventory basically requires folks to disclose perfectly legal emissions. And the anecdotal evidence is very strong that folks have been told, hey, your #1 job, Mr. Plant Manager, is to get us off the top 10 list. But it all seems to be anecdotal. I guess my question is there any research that's going to the role of shame in particular in achieving environmental goals? And my sub-question would be, and maybe this gets to my just not understanding your high versus low participation rates, but isn't the relevant shamee the individual emitter, not the country? But I guess I'm not sure about that. I found myself curious about the role of shame to the nation state versus to emitters.
Yeah, so I like the TRI a lot, and I thought I have written and researched it a bit. And one thing is that the TRI, like the Paris Agreement, is a transparency agreement. So it does not actually, it's civil society and newspapers who actually single out the worst emitters in terms of toxics. And perhaps like with Paris, and I think there's a lot of lessons to learn with TRI, is that initially the firms that were like on the top 20 list actually did disproportionately ratchet down their, so I think that shows the kind of stigma at work. But over the long run, because as you point out, it's been around for a while, we actually see much more patchy progress than I think the TRI had originally anticipated. So that some of those firms that were originally really cooperative and reduced their emissions then gradually increase them again, so that today they're now at the same level that they would have been in the absence of the TRI, perhaps. And so I think that there's something to learn from the TRI, especially in terms of, and this is one thing that we point out in the paper, and one thing that's really worrisome is how much this does rely on the attention, the stigma, the anger, the demonstrations, the pushing, the conversations around climate change. And I think with toxics, they have faded into the background a bit, and that's, I think, the worry, is that maybe climate change, people will get what they call climate fatigue. So there's, I think, a real concern there.
I might just add that TRI is review without pledge. And so Paris has that extra element, which is also potentially, I think, efficacious.
Okay, we have a few questions here. Let's start over here and work our way up. Please.
My name's Harrison. I was curious about the projections that you were showing. Do those account for the projections for like overpopulation and for countries that are currently going through industrialization? And how do you think that, like, do the COP agreements actually account for those types of things? Like, do they offer solutions to those countries that will be going through industrialization in 10 years?
Well, so those are two different questions. So one question is really sort of about the numbers. And I mean, the projections of business as usual temperatures, for example, and on pledges. Right. The answer is notionally yes, but as I was trying to point out, those numbers are not, I mean, what you can really read off of that graph that we showed you is business as usual is worse than what people are actually doing in the world. The perfect conformity to pledge world is better than what people are now doing. And even under the most optimistic scenario, it's not nearly good enough. Now, having said that, the uncertainty is likely to make it all much worse than much better, although if climate sensitivity turns out to be different than we think, then it could be better. I mean, the second issue that you raise is the single most important and fundamental issue, and it goes back, I guess, to another graph that we showed, or the 1 billion major emitters graph that Jennifer showed, which is that, you know, we live in a world where emissions are just orders of magnitude different between people and countries. 300 million people in India don't have any access to electricity at all. So the problem is a much more difficult problem, you know, than the normal kinds of public goods problems that we're used to thinking about, because hundreds of millions of people in the world need to use more energy, just like billions of people in the world need to use much less energy. Particularly difficult problem.
So that raises, I mean, let me just interject with a comment or question. That really raises the broad economic issue of how do you have cross-subsidies where they're appropriate? What is the role of the developed countries in dealing with this to help the developing countries along the line who say we can't afford this, we can't do this, and India being certainly an example where it's not clear that they would be able to meet their pledges. Are there some thoughts that you have on that issue, or want to bring up?
Well, I mean, so I don't know if this really sort of rises to the level of a thought, but I mean, the problem is that problem has been recognized since the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and so all of the language is in the Framework Convention about the need to help with technological transitions, the need to support adaptation, the need to share information about mitigation. All of that is there. There's been talk about this $100 billion adaptation fund that was actually in Copenhagen as well, because those 7 guys in a room who were trying to get out of town without being, you know, strung up by civil society. One of the things they did is they said, we'll give poor people $100 billion, now let us out of town. And so then that's continued to go into Paris, but nobody knows how that money is going to be computed in the first place. $100 billion is a different thing if I give you a check for $100 billion, or if basically DuPont is going to do $100 billion worth of investment. So all of that remains, you know, to be seen.
On the table.
Well, and there are some people who are really optimistic about the lack of path dependency in those countries, the lack of infrastructure, the idea that you never have a landline, you go straight to a cell phone. The same could be true for solar, right? This is what everyone is. I think there is an optimistic side of that conversation too.
You got a question here?
I had-
Introduce yourself too.
I'm Koji Miyazaki. I'm from Japan. I have a question about the role the private sector plays in the context of COP21. So recently we've seen increased commitment of the private sector, such as we've looked at how Walmart is redefining its sustainable supply chain management, or we've seen BP's executive talking about climate change action. So I was wondering how the private sector will come into what COP21 is talking about, and if private sector is already taking initiative, what exactly is the role of governments or the role of international society to prevent this problem from happening?
Well, one stigmatization campaign at COP21 I didn't mention was the concern about the number of private energy companies' involvement in COP21, right? So you probably saw some of the news around Paris. They had this huge display dedicated to that in the center of Paris. But I think that to me, that's my main interest in business, is that, you have Exxon, who's in 35 countries, 100 some countries, 35 biggest economy if you look at revenues. And its role in climate, I think, is arguably more important to some degree than perhaps even the small island states or something like that. So do you have one private sector?
No, obviously the private sector is going to be hugely important, but it won't act autonomously. I mean, that's the business as usual scenario and all the stuff Howard's talking about how we create structures to move them, of which these informal sanctions are going to be part, but also restructuring economic incentives will be part as well. They're important.
And back, please. Your name, please.
Yeah, Catherine. How do you think the change in U.S. government is going to affect commitment to the Clean Power Plan, and how's that going to affect COP21 commitment?
We're divided on this issue, so Dale should go first. He's the more optimistic
That's
one.
another seminar.
So I'm basically a structural, more or less a structuralist about American climate policy, in the sense that I think if you look at it historically, from 1992 until present, it hasn't changed very much. The signals that parts of the American government give to the international community change. The rhetoric changes, but by and large the emissions have, essentially until fracking hit, emissions were steadily increasing, and they happened after Al Gore wrote Earth in the Balance and became vice president, and they continued when George W. Bush became president. Because I think we're talking about kind of deeper structural factors here. So, and also I tend to see this issue as not one, will this happen or not, yes, no, on, off. I see this as sort of, this will happen. The economy will decarbonize. It's a question of how to get there, how quickly. And with a lot of social change, things happen, very, very late. I mean, how long did it take to get the lead out of gasoline, How long did it take to get seatbelts in cars? Because people, there's a lot of economic actors that are hanging on to the marginal dollar, in a business as usual scenario until they can't anymore. Political leadership makes a difference, but I don't think it makes that much difference.
One vision.
Yeah.
Jennifer has the other view.
Well, I have the vision that I left this country for Canada in 2005 and worked on climate change for my master's and felt like there was absolutely no progress and feel totally different about it now. And I can't relate that exactly, right, to a change. Maybe there is a structuralist idea, but the idea that we can talk about climate change now, that the science is generally accepted by our president, I think those are important changes. I would hate to go back to a period where that was not the case.
No. I think that's a really important issue. We forget what it was like a few years ago, at least now.
He certainly has. He's so positive about it.
Everyone, please introduce yourself too.
I want to say I'm the executive director of our research center here. I think the illusion of Paris, coming from a French person who grew up in Paris, is also that all that was led by a country which is getting 75% of its energy from nuclear. So, I mean, you talk about this question at the beginning. I'm not going to enter into your discussion, but I could. Not in front of many people, at least. But that's very interesting that, the success coming from the country, it's really a diplomatic effort, more than an economic effort,
Right.
more than a social. And France is is great at that, or used to be even greater at that. So for the current administration in France, it's a great diplomatic success. Is that a great trade success? No. Are we going to sell more nuclear facility? No. The point I was going to make with the COPs, and you've been to a few of them, you start going there, there's the illusion that we give governments a lot of power over their people and economy, when in reality, many of them don't have that power anymore. So you get them together and you believe that even the vice president going there, the president going there, will come back home and say, let me tell you what to do. And that's called dictatorship. We don't have that here. That doesn't work very well. So one thing we were talking before coming here is, if you had to think about what the real power is today to influence, I mean the people obviously, but also who's driving ExxonMobil economic agenda, the shareholders of Exxon. Who owns Exxon today? To me, that's the most concrete question you can ask. And who owns Exxon today by large order of magnitude? Pension funds, insurance companies, big asset managers. If you take the BlackRock and the Vanguard of the world, and you convince them to move in one direction, they own 10 or 15% of these big oil corporations. That's the point that you can address by convincing these people. If you can convince the senior management of these big asset management firms, it's a big winning proposal, at least on the private sector side. Otherwise, you're going to knock at the door of Exxon and Conoco and BP. They're not going to do anything until their big shareholders actually tell you to behave differently.
Well, I think a structuralist might argue, though, that a certain type of person is selected to be in that position.
Yeah, I mean, 3 points. One is the kind of way of taking your point on board is to say you've given us another focus for where all kinds of sanctioning, informal and formal, can actually be applied. It's another pressure point. The second point, though, that I would make is the climate change issue is occurring against, I think, a very large background, which people often talk about as problems of the Anthropocene. And the problems of the Anthropocene are characterized by the fact that we're living in a highly technologized, highly consumptive mass society of more than 7 billion people. And people are bringing about a radical remaking of the planet without this being intended, without there being anyone who really claims agency over these outcomes. And I suspect, you would know better than I, but I suspect these fund managers would also defer their agency to someone else when they come under pressure, just like the pension funds defer their agency to talking about their fiduciary responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And so we go around in the circle of evaded agency. And that is a problem, I think, that is really the core problem that we face. The other thing I want to say, lest I sound too much now depressive or deterministic or structuralist, is we do know that that governments can make a difference and climate policy can make a difference. I mean, Germany is an excellent example of this, for example. So it's not as though governments no longer have any ability. One problem we have in the US, which is a whole other conversation, is really, I think, a kind of democratic deficit that actually makes it very difficult for popular preferences about many subjects to actually translate into effective policy.
We have seen that for sure. Question over here, please. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jennifer Ruger. I work in global health governance, and so I'm interested in hearing more about the positive side of this, not just the shaming and the honor, but the moral persuasion and the education, and in terms of possibly reconceptualizing interests and aligning a broader conception of interests with some sense of what the right or ethical thing to do is, and sort of if you could talk more about those strategies.
Well, I mean, so if you look across different organisms, and especially non-human animals, you'll find punishment very regularly to enhance cooperation. I think where humans are especially unique is in reward. I mean, this is where it seems like we are bizarre. And I think the idea of, I mean, the Guardian's been really active with this, at least in the private sector. You know, their Sustainable Business Awards. All of my students in the business school at NYU want to be Elon Musk. The B Corps initiatives, right? The idea that you can get a lot of prestige, but also make very good money by being a corporation more concerned about social impact. I think that's all underway in the private sector. And I think we are getting, there was plenty of that at the nation state level as well, in terms of, at least my impression with Christiana was she was very much a positive force in all of this in terms of the INDCs and everything, encouraging. And it's not like we're intending to say that the stigma or shame or the stick will be the only means of promoting cooperation, but just why it might be of particular interest.
I mean, the other thing is these things often, we often pull them apart, like, oh, this is all negatives, this is all positive. But these things actually they're very closely tied together. So going back to this story of the British abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, one of the real challenges there that's also, I think, an analogous challenge to climate change was to make the distal effects of something proximate in people's lives, right? So part of the problem is we go around, we emit carbon, we buy stock, we do whatever we do. It emits this colorless, odorless, tasteless stuff into the atmosphere where it does a bunch of complicated stuff that only scientists understand. And then there's a hailstorm that wipes out your Mercedes or something, and then we go. But I mean, so somehow the challenge is to make those distant effects felt in your life. And in Britain, one of the most effective campaigns that was undertaken was the blood sugar campaign. And essentially the campaign was to get people to see sugar as blood. When you used sugar, you bought sugar, you interacted with sugar, you would see the blood of the slaves who produced that sugar. It was an enormously effective campaign. And it has a shaming side, you're eating blood sugar, but it has a positive side. I'm a righteous man who drinks my tea without sugar.
I just wanted to, first of all, thank you, Dale, for I think the refrain from Ecclesiastes sort of comes to mind in comparing the framework convention language with the Paris Agreement, which was just quite striking. I want to pick up on your point about evading agency, and I wonder if that's one complicating factor with relying on shame in a governmental context. And I'm wondering if, particularly for a country like the U.S. with a division of power, right? You mentioned the Supreme Court stay. Is the Supreme Court shamed?
Dale does, yeah.
Is the U.S. shamed? I mean, who is it that's shamed if the Supreme Court does that? So we have this difficulty in government is it's a different type of collective action problem. It's a collective problem of assigning responsibility in a collective system, right? And then we have also we have sort of cross-sectional diffusion of authority that allows the evasion and maybe a dissipation of shame. But we also have Howard's observation about not in my term of office, right? And that's a dimension, or a temporal dimension, if indeed a country, the U.S., doesn't meet its targets. Is it the responsibility of whoever happens to be president at that time? With this administration, for right or wrong, I mean, it points often to problems that it inherited from the Bush administration. I'm sure the Bush administration did the same with the Clinton administration and so forth, right? So we see that sort of thing happening all the time. And I guess at the end of the day, should we be, this is your question, should we be hopeful, or are we really still in, a dark time?
Well, so honestly, in a way, from my point of view, this talk is in a way deflationary because in terms of legal architecture, we don't have much to show for 30 years past the Framework Convention. So if there is anything to be optimistic about, it's the sort of stuff Jennifer's talking about. It's all the stuff that's going on around. And even there are points of vulnerability. I mean, some just have to do with the weakness of these mechanisms that we've talked a little bit about. But some has to do with these specific vulnerabilities. And in the case of the American political context, I mean, what you say is right on. And I would just put this very kind of almost aphoristically. one problem that we have in the United States with respect to the Paris Climate Agreement is, okay, here's another way of putting it. When the bilateral deal was made between China and the US, and you read the American press, it said, well, I don't know about those Chinese. Will they keep agreements? You know, and of course, this was, from my point of view, entirely the backward question, you know, to be asking. And now we're in a situation where, because the American political establishment, whether it's the court, whether it's the Congress, whether it's the president, we talk to ourselves, and we tend to be almost wholly unaware of the signals that we're sending to other partners with whom we have to cooperate in this area. And sometimes our signals, as in the Supreme Court stay, can actually be much worse than, you know, the actual substantive effects. So I think it's quite possible that the United States could really be the major threat to the success of the Paris Accord, while in terms of our domestic politics, we won't even have understood what we did to bring it down.
Want to make a comment?
Well, I was just going to say that Dale and I were talking on the train here about what this 30 years has meant. So, for instance, that the bank track people, they say we want, of course they need to be sort of, the entity we go after has to have bad behavior, but they also have to be capable of changing. That's why they go after banks rather than the coal companies themselves. So I think the strategy that civil society is taking is also interesting, that they're saying, I'm not wasting my time on Inhofe. He's not going to change. His constituents are not going to change. We're going to go after these other senators or other politicians who are more on the edge. And everyone's thinking that way now, I feel, more than they used to be, at least from what I can see in the literature.
So we're going to have to bring this to a close, and let me make just a couple of comments at the end that amplify on the points that have been made here. I was involved over the last 4 years with IPCC, and in the process of that, we had to bring a whole set of countries together at the last meeting, and they argued for 8 hours as to whether or not they were going to have a statement that climate change is a global commons problem, and it finally got into a footnote in the final report. I think things have changed radically since that time, really, in Paris bringing that up, and you highlighted that. This is a global climate problem, and it's a problem, really, that you've highlighted for all of us, that you're going to have to bring in these dimensions, such shame and honor and other things, along with a lot of other factors that have been brought out today, and I think that's what's made this discussion so fascinating. The social norms have got to change, and this is part of what you're talking about. And I think we're all going to look forward, and I think more optimistically, I think after this discussion than before, to trying to see ways of really dealing with this problem. So please join me in thanking our two.